Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Alexei Arbatov, who is a deputy of the State Duma of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. He is deputy chairman of its Defense Committee and heads the Commission for Defense, Security, and Ratification of International Treaties. He is a member of the Council of the Yabloko faction, a political party in the in Russia. From 1976 to 1994, he was a senior researcher of the Institute of the World Economy and International Relations of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, Moscow. He is a doctor of history. Alexei, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
From a young age, you must have learned a lot about the world.
Well, not really, because my young age was under the Soviet times, when we were quite strongly isolated from the outside world by the Iron Curtain, by censorship. Our information was certainly extremely limited and selective. And that continued as long as till mid-80s, probably, when I was already a researcher in one of the principal academic institutions.
And where were you educated? And what field did you study?
I studied international relations and international economy in a very famous college, which is called Moscow Institute for International Relations. It's a college which teaches students who become diplomats or KGB or high-ranking military and or economists. So legal, it has very strong legal department too. So it was a kind of elite college which I graduated from.
And what did you do your doctoral dissertation on?
In Russia, we have different system from the United States. We actually have 2 PhD dissertations. It's more like German. Mm-hmm. My first PhD, which corresponds to American PhD, was on McNamara decision-making on major weapon programs in the Pentagon. I was very interested of that subject. Already at that time, I'm very much interested in defense policies, security issues. I defended it in 1976. And then I had my second doctoral dissertation, Germans would call it doctor, in early 80s. And it was fully dedicated to Soviet-American strategic balance, evolution, and negotiations on strategic arms reduction.
Mm-hmm. How then did the fall of communism affect you? Your thinking about the world and the goals that you had for your own career?
Well, the fall of communism certainly surprised me very much. However, it didn't affect much my views, because I already got quite disillusioned with the system since early 70s, when I was already a researcher in the Academy of Sciences, and where I could read a lot of foreign literature and talk to foreigners and start to understand that Soviet policy was not always correct. And later I became having very serious doubts on Soviet domestic political system and economic system. Of course, I was affected by works of Solzhenitsyn and activities of Sakharov and so on. So by the time communists collapsed, I didn't have any scruples or I was not sorry about that. From the very beginning of Gorbachev era, I joined very actively Soviet reforms, which were started under Gorbachev, and participated in many negotiations and activities dedicated to put an end to Cold War, to achieved major disarmament agreements with the West and with the United States in particular. But certainly when it all fell apart in 1991, it was like a surprise, a shock. However, I had very great hopes about the future of Russia as a democratic country. And that is why it was not so hard for me to come from one period to the other one.
And what led you to go into politics, to leave the academic world and go into politics?
Well, the first steps of Russia as a new country, as a democratic country, brought a lot of misgivings and disappointments. In particular, the devastating shock therapy, Gaidar's economic reforms, the confrontational tactic in domestic politics, that all led to this terrible crisis in Moscow in October 1993, when tanks were firing on parliament, and it was very frustrating and shocking. And at that time I was still in the academic community, but then I decided that the things were going in a very, very wrong direction, and that somebody of active nature should either leave the country for good or join politics in order to try to affect the things, the way things were evolving. And exactly at that time I got an invitation from Grigory Yavlinsky, who was organizing a new political party, to take part in parliamentary elections in December 1993. And I agreed to join, and since that time I've been in parliament.
What are the particular problems that arise in entering the political realm in what is essentially a new democracy? Are there particular challenges in running for office and making your arguments before the voters?
Well, yes, sure. There are huge problems. Some of them are common to all democratic countries which have elections and multi-party system. Some are peculiar to Russia. What is peculiar to Russia is that it's not in Russian tradition to have democracy. The authoritarian and totalitarian tradition goes back in history not only to 70 years of communist rule, but even before that, many hundreds of years to Tsarist Russian Empire. And it's a very painful and difficult process of many mistakes when people receive the right to vote, to elect their leaders, when they become subjects for mass media, for political manipulation, and in particular in a country like Russia, because we had to go through this period very quickly. It was, I would say, crash course in democracy. In other countries, take Western Europe, take the United States, democracy was evolving during hundreds of years, gradually, and the election rights were given gradually to broader and broader number of people. While in Russia, it all came all of a sudden. But I do not want to blame Russian population, Russian public, for being not quite ready for democracy. I think that all in all, during the 90s, Russian public at large showed enormous wisdom and tolerance. Can you imagine any other nation living through 2 putschs, 2 defaults and 2 wars and still supporting democracy? And all that in only 1 decade, in 10 years. I would say that Russian leaders, Russian elite, proved to be much less prepared for democracy and much less prepared to operate under the rule of law, under democratic procedures, than Russian population.
Was this conclusion that you've reached about the Russian people, was that your expectation when you started running? I mean, to go from an academic life in the Soviet Union to going out on the hustings, as we say, pressing the flesh, as Lyndon Johnson used to say, was that a big leap for you to make, or was there kind of a basic trust of the people?
It was certainly a very big leap and very hard choice. I remember spending several sleepless nights thinking over my future when I had to make the choice to join politics and to leave secure and familiar academic environment, which I loved very much and which I love still now, and which has enormous advantages. Besides, already at that time, I was beyond 40, so I was very well established. I had a great future as in the academic community, and changing it so drastically certainly was not easy. But I'm not sorry about it now.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of your main concerns in the Parliament has been the issues that actually was the focus of your research when you were an academic, namely foreign policy, international relations, and so on. Now, during this period that we're talking about of your entry into politics, an international relations specialist would say that Russia was going through a period of decline, in its standing in the world. What are some of the problems that, as a parliamentarian, you've had to address in dealing with this a very stark transition that Russia has been going through, from being a superpower to just being one of the major powers?
Since I am on Defense Committee, my primary area is Russian defense policy, and in particular military reform. So in a new external environment and new domestic environment, Russian armed forces suffered a lot from drastic reduction of budgets, from mismanagement, from all the failures at military reform. And I think that the history of 10 years since 1993 was very painful for Russian military. My primary preoccupation is with the military reform, but since military reform has to deal with military requirements and strategy and doctrine and arms control, certainly I am very deeply involved in foreign policy and international politics as well. Mm-hmm. I think that the Russian international weakness was largely due failures of Russian economic reforms, which made Russia extremely vulnerable, extremely dependent on foreign financial aid. In the 90s, all Russian foreign policy was basically getting new credits from International Monetary Fund and World Bank to serve failing economic reforms, and still it didn't help because there was a crash of 1998, and that affected everything. Very weak diplomacy, very uncertain relations with the West, uncertain relations with China and with newly created nations in post-Soviet space, Russian immediate neighbors, and certainly very weak military, which greatly limited Russian capacity to participate in peacekeeping operations, to conduct efficient arms control negotiations with other countries. I think that was the main problem with Russian foreign policy and downgrading of Russia from the status of superpower to just one of major powers.
So, as a parliamentarian focused on these issues in a new democracy, what processes are key to doing your work? Is it educating the people about the issues? Is it holding hearings and finding out what the story is about procurement policies or military personnel? Or is it, what you did before, namely studying the broader strategic picture and trying to link it to the actual policies for which you hope to have money for?
The work of Russian parliamentarian is very much like the work of American congressmen. So it's mainly affecting the policy making of the government, which is a major preoccupation. And we do that through adopting all kinds of laws which define Russian defense establishment, its operational procedures, the status of various armed forces, the allocation of decision-making power between various agencies, and also through the budget, which provides money for everything that armed forces do. So that is the principal task of every member of parliament in the area in which he or she works. For me, it's on defense committee, that is the budgets, the legal process of adopting new laws or amending laws. Just to give you an example, now I'm in the midst of a process of proposing a new law, which was drafted under my leadership and my responsibility during the last 3 years. Now it's out and will be in May discussed in Russian Parliament. The law is called on the status of participants of armed conflicts and combat actions. Mm-hmm. And that defines the status of the military who are sent to fight in local wars or peacekeeping operations, so that these people have various benefits and social security, and that their rights are secured because they have to sacrifice whatever military sacrifice during a war, actually in peacetime, when the rest of the people live in peacetime. I had to travel a lot to combat zones, to what we call hotspots in Tajikistan, Dagestan, many times in Chechnya. I was twice in Kosovo during the war. I've been to many other places where there is combat action. So that's an example of the work that I have to do in Parliament.
You, in your academic career, had thought a lot and focused on U.S., then Soviet relations, and now as a parliamentarian, U.S.-Russian relations. What is your assessment of where we are in those relations?
Well, I think that relations during the last 2 years were better than ever. There was unprecedented scale of cooperation after September 11th between Russia and the United States to fight against international terrorism, and a successful operation in Afghanistan, which was a result of very close cooperation between Russia and the United States, is a great achievement, certainly, for the world security and for Russian security as well, since Taliban was immediate threat to Russian security in the south. However, now we have come to a very serious threshold, because American policy in Iraq is not supported in Russia by either population or political and strategic community. It's also not supported in Europe by main American allies, to say nothing about China and Islamic world. I think that what happens in Iraq will affect Russian-American relations for many years to come. I hope that we can live through this hard period without major damage, but that requires a lot of skills. And at this particular moment, I do not see such skills either in Washington or in Moscow.
as we're on the threshold of war with Iraq, there is a period that comes before that in which many of the achievements in arms control, which were begun in the Soviet period, in the Soviet Union's relations with the United States, have been unraveling. That agenda, whether it was the United States ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or deciding unilaterally to end the ABM Treaty, or on the part of the Bush administration really questioning all the arms control agenda, basically, finishing up maybe on START 2, but questioning the need for that in the future. What, as a Russian parliamentarian, is your reaction to that, as somebody who works in a parliament but who also has this background and understanding of what that agenda was all about during the Cold War?
I think that Americans in this particular area are following Russian tradition, and to put it more precisely, following Soviet communist tradition. First destroy everything and then start building something new. And usually that doesn't work, because transitions in history happen not like opening a new page. They are based on the preceding events and preceding structures, achievements, in particular international treaties. I think that the United States, during the last 3 years, committed a number of mistakes of historic dimension, dismantling the international security system and system of arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation that was created during the decades of Cold War, instead of amending it very carefully with great skills to adjust it to new threats and new realities. Just to give you one example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was very closely linked to Non-Proliferation Treaty. Would it not be easier to fight proliferation of weapons of mass destruction if we had a ratified Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and a strong instrument to make all other nations who want to be treated as civilized partners join this treaty, and then in this way guarantee that they will not be able to develop and test nuclear weapons? For instance, we could apply this to India and Pakistan, apply this to Israel, make North Korea and Iran join this treaty. We would put a cap on India and Pakistan nuclear programs, and we would effectively put a cap or stop potential nuclear programs of other countries. Instead of that, the United States rejected this, and now when North Korea withdraws from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, what can you tell them? You cannot tell them to stay in the treaty or blame them because the United States started this process. The same relates to ballistic missile defense, same relates to strategic arms control. We have an old treaty which corresponds basically to the times of Cold War, but we do not have any new serious treaty that would make us certain about our strategic relationship in 10 to 15 years from now. And I think that this is a great mistake. You can use your preponderant power in two ways. Either you use it to build and fortify international system of cooperation and security, or you can destroy the system to free your own hands to do whatever you want. But you do not have to forget that there are many other nations which will join this game, and there are new superpowers on the horizon, and they will come in a vacuum, and you'll have a lot of trouble with them.
So in a way, your assessment is a general one about the way the superpower, the United States, acts across a whole series of realms, namely that do you go for an effort to build an international structure based on international law and rules and so on, or do you make unilateral decisions about what is in your interest in the short term with really negative consequences for the long term?
Right, right.
Let's talk about a little about this global challenge of terrorism that we have right now. Now, you alluded to the fact that in the beginning there was a great deal of cooperation on the part of President Putin with regard to American action in Afghanistan and in other ways. And this was a difficult choice for him in the context of the Russian political system?
That was a very difficult choice because before September 11th, our relations were not very good. Actually, they were encountering larger and larger difficulties on strategic arms control, on NATO expansion, on the war in Yugoslavia that happened in 1999 and stirred unprecedented anti-American feelings in Russian public opinion and political elite. And the failures of reform of the 90s, which were certainly primarily responsibility of Russian leaders, were also connected to Americans because they supported and encouraged the reforms of economy undertaken under Gaidar and his successors, and that proved to be a total failure and brought a great crash of 1998. So there were many recriminations against Americans and very strong anti-American feelings. Actually, attitude towards Western Europe was much better than towards the United States in Russia. However, when that tragedy happened on September 11th, there was a very genuine, great feeling of sympathy among Russian people, purely on humanitarian reasons. And there were many flowers that were brought by simple Russian citizens to American embassy in Moscow. And so when President Putin was deliberating on his policies, he had to take into account both the general very strong anti-American feelings in Russia, the humanitarian dimension of the tragedy, and the future security threats that were demonstrated by terrorist acts, and which threatened certainly Russia, just like the United States and many other countries. And he made his choice in favor of full-scale cooperation with the United States and with the West in general, but primarily with the United States as long as Afghanistan, war in Afghanistan was an issue. In that, he didn't have support of the majority of Russian public opinion. The majority of Russian public opinion, something like 70%, was to preserve neutrality, to keep neutral position. Let Americans do it if they want, but Russia will not get in Afghanistan. And certainly there was a very bitter experience with the war in Afghanistan during the 80s, which Russians still remember very well. However, President Putin made his choice, relying approximately on 10% of the members of parliament who advised him to go full way to cooperate with the United States. And he most probably believed that that would help improve drastically Russian-American relations, address new security threats, and also improve relations so that some other problems would be resolved on an equal and fair basis, like ABM treaty, NATO expansion, economic issues, the problem of Chechnya, which is very painful to President Putin. So that was apparently his calculation.
And he had, in this initial phase, much to offer in terms of intelligence assets and also giving up the potential threat to Russia by the movement of U.S. forces in Central Asia to get at Afghanistan.
Well, he had to offer a lot, certainly. Not only basic infrastructure in Central Asia, influence of Moscow with Central Asian republics, which had direct bearing on situation in Afghanistan, but also arming and training the Northern Alliance, which consisted mostly of Tajiks and Uzbeks, and which had very close connections with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. But Uzbekistan and Tajikistan were at great confrontation with each other. Those two countries had very bad relations, so it was largely up to Russia to make them come to an agreement without which Northern Alliance would not have been able to perform successfully. Besides, Russia armed Northern Alliance with Russian arms. There were massive arms transfers to Northern Alliance. Russian instructors trained, and in some cases, as far as I know, Russian officers even guided Northern Alliance into action, into combat action. That was very important because it provided the United States with possibility to avoid ground warfare, which always very messy and bloody and would certainly cost relatively many casualties to American forces. American action in Afghanistan during the active phase of the war was confined mostly to air and missile operations.
Now, what, from your view, would a more mature response be to the threat of terrorism? You were suggesting earlier that a multilateral agenda would look for multilateral ways of dealing with the problem of terrorism, whether in a treaty, whether in definitions of who a terrorist is, and so on. What would that sort of international dialogue look like, and how could Russia contribute to that if a different trajectory was chosen for dealing with terrorism?
Well, certainly we need new international law sections to address this issue, because what we have now are a number of conventions and agreements which are very vague as to their definition of international terrorism and to demands and requirements towards nations to contribute to struggle against terrorism. We need much more precise definitions so that terrorism is not, war against terrorism is not used as a pretext to justify other purposes, which happens, both domestic purposes and external purposes, and which discredits the very notion of joint fight against terrorism. We also need mechanisms that would provide for assessing of the data, of linking particular rogue states to terrorism, and take decision on punishing them collectively. The mechanisms of the United Nations presently are very weak with respect to that. But beside that, we certainly need many other things: cooperation of intelligence services, cooperation of financial control services, and setting thousands and thousands of new standards on our everyday and behavior. Just one example. What is the sense of having such time-consuming and thorough security procedures in American airports when and if procedures are quite relaxed, for instance, in Roman airport, and the airplanes coming from Italy to the United States, have not gone through all those procedures. The same, so I don't want to offend Italy, it's just an example. The same relates to India, to Pakistan, to all countries which send their airplanes to the United States. You cannot cut off all those communications, either by airplanes or by other things. You cannot build an iron wall around yourself to protect you against terrorism. So the only way is to create a multilateral framework, both for active operations against terrorism and for defense and security procedures against terrorism. In order to do that, certainly a leader is needed. But a leader, like the United States certainly may claim to be a leader, which is keen on working through multilateral procedures, creating consensus, creating common approach, rather than saying to everybody, we are so powerful, we can disregard what you think, we'll do it on our own. That approach would never work.
Let's take the case of your own countries trying to deal with the struggle in Chechnya. And what I would like to do is draw on your experience as a parliamentarian in a new democracy on the one hand, and somebody with an internationalist vision of the way multilateralism can work to help sort out some of these issues. Assess for me the failures and successes of the Russian government in dealing with their own province.
That's a very broad subject. To put it in a very simplified and concise manner, the experience of many countries, including the United States and Russia, shows that the government and organized armed forces cannot defeat armed insurgency, either in foreign country or on one's own territory, without fulfilling two basic requirements. One, which is of utmost importance, is to deprive the insurgents from the support of the majority of local population. The second, which is not so important but still very important, is to isolate the area of insurgency, to in a sense to blockade it, so that insurgents do not have free passage across the borders to get replenishment, reinforcement, arms, and everything. I cannot, for the shortage of time, to go into detail to show that those two are very closely intertwined. I'll just give one example. If insurgents have freedom of passage through the borders, their tactics usually is hit and run. The armed forces, which are always the primary target for terror acts and attacks and ambushes and mine warfare, they cannot catch those insurgents, and their retaliation mostly hits local population, which alienates local population and pushes it away from the legal authorities towards supporting insurgents. That's just one example how closely those two are related. I could go on describing other aspects, but suffice it to say that the experience shows that without fulfilling the two requirements or conditions that I mentioned, organized armed forces, whatever their superiority in firepower, technology, and numbers, are never able to do away or to put under control or to eliminate the insurgency of armed opposition, which uses primarily guerrilla warfare and terrorist methods of operation. American experience in Vietnam was very good example. They were not able to fulfill the two requirements, to bring majority of southern Vietnam population to the side of Saigon regime and American armed forces, and to isolate the theater. However much they bombed Ho Chi Minh Trail, they were not able to do that. The same, and they failed. They were defeated. The same goes for Soviet operation in Afghanistan. Soviet army was defeated because was unable to achieve that. And the same happened during the two Russian campaigns in Chechnya. The first one in the 90s, and the second one, which is still continuing now. In contrast to that, military victory in Afghanistan happened precisely because the two requirements were met. The majority of the population, in various ways, was encouraged or attracted to support anti-terrorist coalition and to oppose Taliban. And the theater was isolated because all the borders around Afghanistan were closed by countries joining anti-terrorist operation. Now in Iraq, it's not clear what will happen. There is no doubt Americans are able to defeat Saddam Hussein's army very quickly and demote Saddam Hussein. But if there is a serious insurgency and terrorist activity against American troops, American administration, and the new regime that will be installed in Baghdad, without fulfilling the two conditions, it would be impossible to achieve any kind of conclusive victory.
The Bush administration has proposed for dealing with terrorism and rogue states a doctrine of preemption. Basically, the notion that for them is that in this new world we're entering or have entered after 9/11, the really greatest danger for world stability is the link between so-called rogue states, disintegrating states, and terrorist transnational groups, and the link that is of most concern, is weapons of mass destruction. And from this equation, they draw the conclusion that the U.S. must, if necessary, act unilaterally to anticipate and prevent the kind of threats that would emerge. Assess for us this argument from both a Russian perspective and from somebody who's thought a great deal about strategic issues.
I think that in principle, this doctrine is quite acceptable to deal with new threats. You cannot wait till terrorists attack to retaliate, because most of the time there is nowhere to retaliate. Terrorists are not a nation with their assets which could be attacked in retaliation. They are an elusive network which envelops the whole world. So you have to find their weak points, or the most important, essential points of their networks, which are most of the time associated with particular states which support terrorism. And then you have to take action, whatever necessary, even military action, in a preemptive way or preventive way. I don't have any problem with that. I have serious problem with something else. Such actions may be effective in reaching their goal only on the basis of international cooperation of all those states which join the common front of fighting against terrorism. Because apart from delivering munition to a particular target, a lot of other things are needed. Intelligence cooperation, closing the borders, working with the local population to make it not support guerrillas and terrorists, conducting peacekeeping operations, contributing to resolution of ethnic and religious conflicts, and many, many other functions, which neither country, however strong and powerful, can perform at a global scale on its own. And when we are talking about international terrorism, we are talking about global scale, because terrorist cells may be found everywhere, in Afghanistan, in Chile, in Australia, in Philippines, everywhere. So you need really a global cooperation. So if the rogue states and their link to terrorists is internationally recognized on the basis of persuasive facts and evidence. If there is an agreement on the necessity to take violent action with respect to particular rogue state or a terrorist site or base, then certainly such actions are legitimate and good and useful. If, on the contrary, there is no international agreement on defining particular culprits, when there is no agreement on which methods to use against such a country, then unilateral actions actually destroy anti-terrorist cooperation. First of all, because they create great tensions among nations, which effectively stop cooperation. Secondly, because they encourage a kind of free-for-all world. And Russian, French, Indian, Chinese idea of which are rogue states may differ a lot, and may in and of itself create conflicts among leading powers if they do not come to agreement on basic principles. If Americans are entitled to hit Iraq unilaterally, then why Russia is not entitled to do the same with respect to Georgia? Why China is not entitled to do the same with respect to some other neighboring country, which, according to Chinese views, may be supporting insurrection in Tibet or Xinjiang? Why, say, India is not entitled to hit Pakistan, which openly supports terrorists in Kashmir, and which has nuclear weapons, and which has very fragile domestic situation under which fundamentalists any day can come to power, in particular after the war in Iraq, if it starts and provokes a massive wave of Muslim fundamentalism and radicalism.
But isn't, if somebody from the Bush administration were in this discussion, they might say, but yes, but really the problem is one of definition, which then is part of the political struggle. And if we take the time to fight about definition and circumstance, you know, we're watching the already lit fuse shorten and shorten. So, for example, your country's relations with Iran on the, you know, in the trade in nuclear technology, claims are made, you know, on the U.S. side about, you know, the potential danger there, about whether Iran is a rogue state, you know, about how dangerous that situation is. My point is, you know, not to take sides one way or another, but to say that this definitional issue, you know, the label we will attach and this notion of action is very complicated in international politics, and this for particular administration, the Bush administration, you know, feels that time is running out, whether rightly or wrongly. Comment on that and that kind of argument that might come from the Bush administration.
Well, first of all, since the Black September, already a year and a half elapsed, and that's enough time to reach agreement on very important and complicated issues if there is a will and desire to find consensus. If there is a will to do everything unilaterally, then 10 years would not be enough. But if there is a will and understanding that cooperation and consensus is essential, a year and a half is enough of time. Secondly, there is no other way to build and fortify coalitions but to negotiate such things and come to an agreement. The only other way is free for all, and that may destroy anti-terrorist coalition, greatly enhance activities of terrorists and rogue states, which would be able to play on controversies among leading powers, and that certainly would create great conflicts between leading powers. Just one example. According to Russian threat perceptions, it's not Iraq, but rather Pakistan, which is the major potential threat. Russia is trying to maintain good relations with Pakistan, and recently Pakistani president visited Russia, but in Russian political and strategic communities there is great fear of Pakistan. Pakistan is not only supporting guerrillas in Kashmir against India, but Pakistan is known for supporting terrorist organizations. In the past that was Taliban, and Pakistan supported it together with Saudi Arabia. Now Chechen terrorists and armed insurgents have financial and material support from Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and some other countries. Pakistan already has nuclear weapons, and Pakistani missiles already cover a large part of Russian Siberia. So what is Russia to do? Is Russia entitled to apply its own strategy with respect of Pakistan, like Americans are doing with respect of Iraq? I do not think this is right. I think that on Iraq and on Pakistan and on many other issues, we have to act in a cooperative, joint manner on the basis of consensus. For that, there is no other way but to negotiate. But you know, the difficulty of negotiations is largely being exaggerated by those who in principle do not want negotiations, who want to do everything in a unilateral way. During the times of Cold War, when we were split by ideological, military and political contradictions, which were very acute and very deep, we were still able to reach agreement on many very complicated issues. So now, after the end of Cold War, when we are not split any longer, it's only the will which is required to fix all those important issues.
When you talk about the dangers of weapons of mass destruction, what invariably comes up is the danger of loose nukes and concerns about the security of the arsenal of the former Soviet Union, now Russia. What is your assessment of that danger? Not that Russia would do something, but the security of its own decaying weapons is a potential problem, and how satisfactory has been U.S.-Russian relations in dealing with that problem?
Russian nuclear weapons are pretty secure, both strategic and tactical. There are very thorough procedures and technologies used to make them safe. And with that respect, Russians during the 90s certainly were very much helped by American aid through the non-Lugar program. And we are grateful for that. And nobody in Russia, even experts and politicians, which might have very grief feelings, a lot of grievances and hostility towards the United States, but still nobody, even of those groups, would say something bad about this particular program and its positive effect. In this sense, that was a great achievement and an exception from other areas of our relations, both security and economic, which are a subject of a lot of recriminations in Russia and, as far as I know, in the United States as well, also for different reasons. Nuclear materials are not as safe as nuclear weapons. As long as we are talking about spent nuclear fuel from nuclear reactors, the nuclear materials which are received after dismantling nuclear weapons, those are not as secure, and a lot needs to be done to provide secure storage, maybe in non-retrievable form, maybe in other form, so that highly enriched uranium and plutonium do not get into the hands of international terrorists, of which those having enormous financial resources could create crude nuclear weapons and use them in their terrorist plans. It's possible to hire experts. There are a lot of loose experts, not only loose nukes around the world, those who lost their job after the end of Cold War, when their expertise was no longer needed for central arms race. And those could find new contracts with rogue states and terrorist organizations, which have no shortage of money to do that. I think this is a very serious problem.
One final question requiring a short answer. Looking back, you said when you were a specialist, an academic specialist in the Soviet Union, one of the enlightening experiences from you were seeing the contradictions in Soviet policy, what you knew and what was not known, and so on. Now, as a parliamentarian in a democracy, I'm curious, because there must be a great deal of satisfaction on your part as you do the work of democracy in your own country to bring to light problems in foreign policy, to have a public discussion, and to use that platform both within your own country and internationally to raise issues. Talk a little about the satisfactions there and what you've learned.
Well, as a matter of principle, certainly I'm very much satisfied by being present at the creation, so to say. We in Russia are still a very young democracy, and we have a lot of illnesses and deviations, distortions, which accompany a young growing system. We are not a well-established democracy like Western European countries or the United States. So being present at the creation of new Russia is certainly a great challenge and a great opportunity. But we do not think about such things every day. Every day in our work, we are up to our ears in all the controversies and contradictions and process of practical implementation of those noble principles. And so the amount of frustration from everyday work is really very big, very large. There are serious problems in Russia. In particular, during the last few years, there were important and very negative changes with respect to curtailment of some of the democratic principles, the freedom of mass media, the freedom and fair conduct of elections, the fair allocation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branch, between the federal level and the regional level. There were spy processes, spy cases conducted against a number of scientists by security agencies. So all that certainly, and of course the war in Chechnya and the terrorist acts which happen in Moscow, in other cities, in the capital of Chechnya, Grozny. And since I have to deal with that directly on an everyday basis, that brings a lot of frustration, but I accept it as a necessary payment for participating in such an important enterprise, which is building Russian democracy in general, and what relates to me directly, elaborating and implementing reasonable and consistent military reform in particular.
Alexei, I want to thank you very much for this very informative discussion of your intellectual journey and your journey into politics, trying to shape Russia's future. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. That was a great pleasure for me.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.